loved the last 3 weeks already, just looking at this idea of Jesus as our king, our prophet, and our priest. And I loved what God did last week in our service. I found myself this week being particularly tender, I would say. There's something, I don't fully know what God did, I don't think, last week in my heart, but there was a tenderizing that happened for me last week when we gathered. And this week, so many moments of just thinking about Jesus, or something will happen that will bring me back to that place of tenderness in my heart when I think about who he is and what he's done for me. And so I'm excited to share today on a little bit more about Jesus, and just think together about this idea of who he is and what he's done. And so I've got a question for you to begin with. Have you ever watched a movie or maybe a TV show where they start the beginning of the movie, it's almost like it starts with the end of the movie, the end of the story, and then the rest of the movie or the TV show is kind of going back and filling in all the missing pieces to try and for you to understand what was the first scene that really should have been the last scene, but they began with it. Yeah, it can be kind of confusing, right? When you're in that first scene, when you're like, hold on, is this the beginning? Like, are they playing it backwards? Did they mean to do this? Did they edit it wrong? But it's actually a very clever kind of way to write a TV show or a movie, because it is very gripping, right? It hooks you in right from the beginning, because it gets you asking those questions and it gets you very engaged with what's happening right from the beginning, because it is confusing, right? And it's kind of like an instant cliffhanger. Normally, a cliffhanger might happen towards the end, but it immediately you're almost gripped by a cliffhanger because what is happening? And so often you'll get that kind of will happen in maybe action movies or murder mystery type shows or movies. That'll happen a lot, where you're faced with maybe a dead body right at the beginning, or a high-speed car chase, or a fight scene, something like that, to grip you in, and you're like, did I miss something? What's happening? Did I fall asleep already? And then the rest of the story, the rest of the time of that show unpacks and builds back up towards that end scene again. And I'm a big murder mystery fan. I love books like that. I love TV shows, anything like that. And so I really like it when those shows or books start like that, because it gives you lots of time to try and work out who that murderer was, or what the plot is. I love to do that. I like to try and figure out who it was. My mom is like the best at that, though. I don't think she's ever gotten it wrong. We would not she's so good at it that we would not believe her that she had gotten it that early on, because it'd be like 5 minutes in to like a 12-episode show, and she's like, I know who it was already. I'm like, no, you don't. There's no way you could already know who it is. So we would have her like write it down at the beginning, and then hide it away somewhere, and then get it out at the end. And sure enough, she would have got it right at the beginning. So she's really good. I'm not that good at it, but I still like to try. Sometimes I think that our lives with Jesus can be a little bit like one of those movies where we see the end before we know the rest of the story. It kind of can feel like it starts with the end, and we have the rest of our lives with him. The rest of the journey is filling in the gaps between the end and getting to the end. And just like one of those movies where that happens, that can be kind of confusing. It's intriguing, that's for sure, but it can be kind of confusing, and it can be then filled with lots of plot twists and turns as we try and get back to the end. And so what do I mean by that? Well, there's kind of these two elements to the end of the story of Jesus that we already know, that we know for certain. And those two things, the first one of those two things is that the first one is that we will be with Jesus. The end of the story of Jesus, the end of our story with Jesus, is that we know for certain is that we will be with Jesus. Through Jesus' sacrifice, through what he did on the cross, we will be with him for eternity. We will be reconciled with the Father, and one day we will be face to face with the Godhead in heaven for eternity. And this is a promise that Jesus himself makes to the disciples while he is on earth with the disciples. And we find that in John 14. If you have a Bible with you, if you want to turn there, that would be fantastic. We're going to read a few verses together. So John 14, I'm going to start at verse 1 and read through to verse 7. So I'll give you a second to find that. So John 14, starting right at the beginning, at verse 1, says this. Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I am going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. You know the way to the place where I am going. Thomas said to him, Lord, we don't know where you are going, so how can we know the way? Jesus answered, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really know me, you will know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. So here, Jesus is making that promise to his disciples and therefore to us that they will, they're already with him face to face, but they will again be with him face to face. And he's making that promise to us that we will be with him face to face. And if we think this whole knowing the end of the story before we know everything in between is confusing, imagine how the disciples feel. They don't yet understand that Jesus is going, they don't understand the resurrection yet. They're really confused. This whole thing makes no sense to them yet. We have at least the advantage of having read the narrative between the point that Jesus is at right here and the cross and the resurrection. But the point is that we know for certain that we will be face to face with Jesus. That is an assurance that we have, the actual reality of being face to face with Jesus for eternity. And so the second reality that we know for sure at the end of the story of our lives with Jesus is that Jesus is coming back. So first off, we know that we will be face to face with Jesus for eternity. Number two, the second point, Jesus is coming back. And this also is something that Jesus himself spoke about when he was here on earth. And this, must have been really confusing for the disciples because he hadn't even gone anywhere yet. And then now he's talking about coming back. He mentions it in this passage that we just read, but he also mentions it in Matthew 24 when he goes and he describes the signs of the end of the age. He describes the great trials that the world will go through, and he describes the coming of the Son of Man. And he says, then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. And the book of Revelation goes on and describes the second coming of Jesus more, and it's mentioned, in other places in Scripture too. And when it comes to end time theology, when it comes to the idea of Jesus' return, there's lots of ideas and interpretations on how it's going to happen, on exactly what that looks like. And that's, a discussion for another time. That's a whole separate series of messages, one that I will let Rich preach because I have no idea how to do that. There's a whole different ballgame. There's lots and lots of different ideas. But the thing is that whatever you believe specifically about that, the outcome really, really remains the same. The outcome, whatever your end time theology is that Jesus is coming back. That is the central truth that remains the same, regardless of how you think it's going to happen, when it's going to happen, whether it's going to happen in your lifetime or not. The reality is, the end of the story that we know is that Jesus is coming back. And that is paired up with the reality that I, you, we are going to be with Jesus. This is the end of the story. So we know the end of the story, but what does this mean? How do we live? How does that change anything, knowing the end of the story? Does it matter? Does it matter that that we know the end of the story now? Does it affect how we live this side of eternity? Well, I think it matters a lot that we know the end of the story. It's really important that we know these two realities, that we're going to be face to face with Jesus and that he's coming back. And there is a big clue in how it changes things and how we respond to this that we find also in that Matthew 24 passage a little further on. It's one little phrase in one little verse. And that's this. It says, "Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect." Whether we see Jesus face to face because he has come back to get us on earth, whether I actually see him on earth, or whether I see him because my time on earth is over and I've gone to be with him in heaven, regardless of which happens first and which way round I first see him face to face, I have the responsibility, we have a responsibility to get ready, to prepare. That is that's the action that's married with this reality of knowing the end of the story. Our job is to get ready, to prepare to be with him. Getting ready for Jesus. And that's where I want to kind of spend the rest of our time together today, is this idea of getting ready for Jesus. Getting ready for Jesus. Whether that is getting ready for his return or getting ready to go and be with him. Getting ready for Jesus. I have a bit of a confession that I want to share with you today. Get a little bit vulnerable, not too bad. Some of you who know me well will know this about me. And for those of you who don't, hopefully it won't change the way that you think of me too badly. I am can be a pretty chronic procrastinator. I really can be. Depends what it is. I'm the kind of person who likes to be busy, and I'm a pretty productive person overall. I like to get stuff done, but on certain things, procrastination is my go-to thing that I do. And I can't quite stop myself on certain things. I just become a very last-minute person on certain tasks. Things like Christmas shopping, that one always, procrastination is what I go to, meaning that Christmas Eve is a great time to do Christmas shopping. Why would you do it any earlier? Although that does become a lot harder when you move thousands of miles from a lot of people that you have to buy Christmas gifts for, because it takes a while to get them thousands of miles across the world. Also, another challenge of my procrastination issue was when I moved here and discovered that Amazon Prime doesn't mean next day delivery here, which it did in England. That one was hard because I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to have to think at least a little bit further ahead here because Prime is quick. Yeah, okay. It's quick, but not quite as quick. Yeah. So that, certain things, procrastination is what I end up going to. Packing is another thing. If I'm going on any sort of trip, that will be the last thing I do, like 2 hours before I get in the car kind of thing. And my packing procrastination really played out hardcore when I was moving here. It's a pretty big move involving some quite intense packing, taking my whole life across the world, like restarting my life. And I had a very early morning flight to catch to get here. And the night before the early morning flight the next day was the time I decided to start packing my two small suitcases with a weight limit for international flights to try and fit my whole life in to come and start a new life. And luckily, I have a very patient mother who was helping me with this process. And so, yes, fairly late, I start the process. And one of the two suitcases I'd actually only purchased that day. I really wasn't prepared. And so it took several hours. And the process entailed trying to fit everything in, realizing quite quickly there was no way it was going to be vaguely within the weight limit, taking everything out, trying to get rid of stuff, putting it all back in. Nope, still not going to be within the weight, taking everything out. This happened several times. Also, we didn't have a luggage scale, so the only way to check the weight each time was to stand on the scale and hold it and then get off and do the math of like my weight minus the bag and all of that. So it was quite the process. My mum did get slightly less patient as it carried on. And she was very good about it though. But there were multiple moments during that whole evening where I would lay prostrate on the floor going, this is pointless, I can't do it, I can't possibly move because I can't fit this in, it's not going to work. I know, I just won't take anything. I'll just go with nothing and I'll buy it all when I get there. My mum was like, you can't do that, that's stupid. And so I ended up, towards the end, I'm like just randomly throwing stuff out. I won't take that. And I get here and realize there's a whole load of stuff I really did need or want. And so the next few days when I first arrived, were spent with me like texting my mom, like, could you send this over? Or could you send this? Or I really did need this. So she then spent a ridiculous amount of money, probably like as much as if I'd just brought another checked bag, mailing stuff across the world to me. So in that instance, procrastination really kicked my butt. Like that was not the time to procrastinate, and it came back to bite me, and I really should have just been more organized and been more prepared. That was not a good time to procrastinate, that is for sure. It would have been a much easier process had I just been a little more thoughtful ahead of time, and would have been more pleasant for everyone. And those last few hours with my mom before moving across the world would have been more enjoyable too. Yes. Any other procrastinators out there? Anyone else tend to leave things to the last minute? Anyone willing to admit that? Yeah, there we go. Well, Josh, thank you. Makes me feel a little better. That's great. Yeah, right. That's great, yeah. My college applications was another one that got left to the very last minute. That one nearly, destroyed my relationship with my mother. That one was, the fact she would help me pack after that was a miracle. Yes, so procrastination, it happens, right? So for any of my other fellow procrastinators out there, whether you would like to admit it or not, this idea of getting ready for Jesus might not sound very exciting, might not sound like something you really want to do, and especially seeing as there's really no timeline that we know when it comes to getting ready for Jesus. He may show up any moment, right? There are times in my life where I pray for him to show up there and then, because if something's going wrong, that's my go-to. I'm like, I don't want to do this thing, or something's going wrong. I'm like, Jesus, just come back now. That's kind of what I do. It's a bit of a joke between me and him. I think he enjoys those prayers. And so we don't know. He may show up any moment, or I may live for the next, 70 years, or medical advances might happen and I could live for 500 years. Who knows? Or we have no idea. There is no timeline. And for a procrastinator, let me tell you, that is the worst case scenario that we could be in, because I'm very much in need of a deadline to get things done. If not, procrastination can just go on forever. But there is the reality that even though we don't know how long we have to get ready. We have to prepare to be with Jesus. So what does getting ready for Jesus look like? What does it mean? What does it look like to live a life where we are preparing, where we are getting ready to be with Jesus? Because we know the end of the story. We know that is coming. And so before we can know how to do it, we need to know why. Why do we even need to do this? Why do we need to prepare to be with Jesus? Why is it important? Well, there's a really short answer to this, and then I may unpack it a little bit more. But the short answer is just simply because he's Jesus and he is worthy of us taking the time to prepare. He is Jesus and he is worthy. When we truly understand who he is in his worthiness, in his holiness, we want to prepare for him. We want to take time to prepare our hearts, to prepare our lives, to prepare who we are, to enter into fullness of relationship with him, face to face, in his presence. This week, as I said earlier, as I've been in this state of just feeling tender to who he is and the reality that he's real and present, I've read many times those verses that I read during ministry time last week from Revelation, this description from John's vision of heaven, of Jesus. And I've been struck by how John had already seen and spent time face to face with Jesus at this point. Yet this description of Jesus, all John can do is use the best words he can find to describe him. These are the words that he could find to describe him. He says, I turned around to see the voice that was speaking to me. And when I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and among the lampstands was someone like a son of man, dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet, and with a golden sash around his chest. The hair on his head was white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze, glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and coming out of his mouth was a sharp double-edged sword. His face was like the sun shining in all its brilliance. And it goes on to say that all John could do was fall to the ground as if he were dead. Seeing Jesus in that state, seeing Jesus face to face in the context of eternity, in the context of heaven, was enough to bring John to his face, to his knees, as if he were dead. He was so overcome by the reality of who Jesus truly is, even having spent time face to face with him this side of heaven. This is the reality, the wonder of who Jesus is. This is the Jesus that we are preparing for, that we're getting ready to spend time with. This is not only who we're preparing for, but it's who we're longing for, who we're longing to be with. And when we understand that this is who Jesus is, it allows us to have our hearts moved, to have our desires aligned with Jesus. You know, if you've ever observed young, teenage girls or girls who love makeup and dresses and all of that stuff, mums of teenagers in the room rolling their eyes, getting ready for important events, maybe prom, homecoming, those types of things, it's quite the process. I was never kind of into that too much. My mum actually might have a different opinion. I don't know. You don't have to ask her. But it's quite the process getting ready for these events, right? I remember I was the designated driver for my sister for her prom, and her friends were all getting ready. Her and her friends all getting ready at my house. And I was like, come on, I have somewhere to be after I drop you off. Let's go. And they were taking so long to get ready because they had all the things, all the processes they went through to get ready, but it's because that thing was so important to them. All the makeup, all the hair, everything they went through was because the event was so important. It held such value in their lives that it was worth them preparing, getting ready to that extent. When we understand who Jesus is and we value him, when we see his worthiness, this idea of getting ready and preparing for him becomes something that's exciting and desirable for us. We long to prepare for him. We long to get ready because we see and we understand who he is. Are we willing to understand who he is and to put the effort in to get ready and prepare for him? Do we understand who he is and his worthiness? 2 Corinthians 3 verse 18 talks about what the process of getting ready looks like a little bit more. And I'm going to read it to you from the Amplified version. So you're welcome to find it in your Bible if you'd like to. It's one verse. We're going to spend a few minutes on it, but I'm going to read it from the Amplified version because there's a little bit of language in there that I think is really helpful for us. So 2 Corinthians 3 verse 18. So I'm going to go ahead and read it to you. And we all, with unveiled face, continually seeing us as in a mirror, the glory of the Lord, are progressively being transformed into his image from one degree of glory to even more glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. I'm going to read that again. And we all, with unveiled face, continually seeing as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are progressively being transformed into his image from one degree of glory to even more glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. This is the story of our entire lives. This is the gap between us meeting Jesus and the end of the story, which we know already, which is the being with Jesus, that Jesus is coming back, or us being face to face with Jesus. This process, this progressively being transformed into his image. This is the getting ready for Jesus. This is what it looks like. This idea of progressive transformation and going from glory to glory as we prepare, as we are getting ready for being face to face with Jesus. This is the story of our entire lives and our entire walk with Jesus. And what I love about this passage is that it doesn't say that we're transformed completely in one moment and then that's it, we're done. It's not a short story. It's a long story. It's the story of our entire lives. You know, it's a novel, not a short story. It's a long story. And the reason I like this translation, the Amplified, right here, is that word progressively. That word progressively. And I think that's super helpful when we're thinking about this idea of being prepared or getting ready. That word progressively, and the idea of being progressively transformed. Because I think sometimes when we think about the idea of transformation, is it can sound like it's something that happens in a moment and then it's kind of done. We get transformed, we're new, it's all better, and then it's done. We get to move on. But this idea of progressive transformation implies something quite different. It implies that it's something that happens over time, and it implies that there's an order to it, that it happens progressively. There are steps involved in this transformation taking place. There is a progression to our transformation, and it takes time for that to happen. And it also takes intentionality for that transformation to happen, for it to take place. It's not going to happen overnight. And if I were to just sit around for the next 60 years, waiting to be face to face with Jesus, waiting for him to either come back or me to go there, the chances are that I'm not going to look a whole lot more like Jesus than I do now. I might. God is good. He can do anything. But the chances are I'm not going to look a whole lot more like him than I do right now. It's going to take me putting in a lot more effort than that for me to get ready to be with him, for me to go from glory to glory, for me to see this progressive transformation in my life. It's going to take a lot more intentionality on my part. There is, however, also the truth. It's one of those tensions that we live in. There's also the truth that I could spend the next 60 years working as hard as I possibly could to look a certain way and still not end up looking any more like Jesus than I do right now. And that's because there's a partnership that takes place. There are some things that only God can do, some things that only Jesus can do, and there's also some things that that's my job to do as well. And this is something that I feel like Jesus has been showing me in my life recently, and that one of the challenges that I face is figuring out what is my job to do and what is his job to do. Because there are some things that it's his job to do, and there are other things that it's my job to do. And we get those things the wrong way around, that's when things get hard and things get messy, and we don't see the change and the transformation that we want to see in our lives when we get those things the wrong way round. Any relationship that's working well is about partnership and partnering well with each other. Anyone who's ever lived with anyone, like a roommate situation or within a marriage, any situation where you live with another person, this plays out very quickly, right? I think about different roommate scenarios I've had. The ones that have worked well are the ones where we have developed a partnership, where we figure out whose job is whose pretty quickly. Now, sometimes that's been very overt, like we've sat down with a list of chores or whatever, and we've divided them out. Other times, it's just kind of naturally happened as we've gone about life together. But the roommate scenarios I've had that haven't worked out well are the ones where that has not happened, either overtly or not. The division of labor has not worked out well. One party or the other has ended up feeling like they're doing everything. The other person maybe doesn't even notice that the other person feels like that, and it doesn't work because the partnership isn't working. The partnership isn't in place, and there's no understanding of whose job is whose. So then things get missed, or sometimes some things end up getting done twice, but maybe they're not even the important things. Like I had one scenario once where the bathroom ended up being cleaned like all the time, but the kitchen never got cleaned, and because there was no communication, there was no partnership, we didn't know whose job was whose, so it didn't work. And our relationship with Jesus isn't immune to some of those same partnership issues as our human relationships are too. There are certain things that are his job, and there are certain things that are our job. And the challenge doesn't come because he's not doing his job, because he's God, so he does his job all the time. The challenge comes when we're not doing our job, when we're not taking responsibility for the things that are our responsibilities, when we're not getting ready, when we're not putting in the work ourselves. That's when the challenge comes. As we figure out what our job is and what is Jesus's job, that is when we can see the fullness of the transformation in our own lives. See, when we get saved, when we meet Jesus, when we're born again, there is significant transformation that happens. And it often happens, in an instant, miraculously. We see huge change in our lives. And that is absolutely real, and it's absolutely what God does, and it's a huge part of my story, is that overnight, God showed up and did huge things and changed huge parts of who I was. Behaviorally, emotionally, so much about who I was and how I was living changed overnight. And that is real and very, very much what God does. And see, being transformed is defined as make a thorough or dramatic change in a form, state, appearance, or character. And that part, the transform, that is Jesus's job. He does that. I couldn't do that in my own life. He does that. To actually change a state, change the appearance, change the character, that is God's job. He does that. We can't actually do that. But then after salvation, after that initial meeting with God, meeting Jesus, accepting him, the rest of our Christian walk, we are continually being formed. This idea of being formed more and more into his likeness. It's the glory to glory. And formed is defined as bringing together parts or combining to create something. And this forming for the rest of our Christian walk, this is where partnership comes in. Because formation doesn't happen on its own. This bringing together of the pieces. Because Jesus takes all the parts of us, all the parts that were created in us, all the parts of who we've become as we've lived our lives, all the parts that he redeemed and transformed as he met with us, and he combines them together. And he creates something out of us. He's continually forming and creating something out of the parts of us as we walk with him. This is the progressive transformation that 2 Corinthians 3:18 is talking about. And it happens over time. It's the partnership of bringing all of those pieces back together and creating something beautiful out of it. It's kind of a little bit like building one of those fancy Lego kits that are clearly not really for kids because they're way too complicated. And I have done one of these. Sophie, do you want to put that photo up? This is one that actually Sonia and I did together. This is the Infinity Gauntlet from Marvel's Avengers. And it was very fun. And Sonia and I did it with Infinity War playing in the background. Our aim was to finish it before the movie ended, which I think we did just about accomplish. Yeah, it was like the end credits, so it was okay. We just about got it done. But yeah, well, I know it is. Well, yeah, that's because, we'll get on to that, you have to follow the instructions. They give you all the pieces in these kits, and they give you instructions. And if you follow the instructions in the order in which they give you the instructions, it's a fairly simple process. If, however, you don't follow the instructions in the order they give them to you, you jump ahead because you think, oh yeah, that bit makes sense, I'll just do that. Then you have to take bits apart again, and it takes you longer than the movie. And that may be what happened to us. And that is a little bit like our life. Jesus actually is giving us instructions. All the parts that we need are there in him. He has everything that we need to get ready for him, to prepare for him, to be transformed into his likeness. In him is everything that we need, and he's giving us instructions. We have the Bible. We have the Holy Spirit. He sent that to us. We have an instruction book to follow, but we don't always use it. When we do, it's a lot easier. Now, admittedly, sometimes the instructions that he gives us do make about as much sense as the instructions in some of these books sometimes, because sometimes you're looking at it going, this picture doesn't quite look like the little pieces here, because when they're like this tiny in the packet and they're like this big in the book, you're like, I don't really know. So admittedly, sometimes the instructions that God gives us make about as much sense as the instructions in the Lego book. But He is giving us instructions, and he is guiding us, and he does want to lead us. He wants us to be transformed. He's not trying to trip us up. He's not trying to slow down our transformation. He's not trying to not make us achieve the end goal, which is to look like Jesus. He wants us to succeed. There is the reality that we are going to be face to face with Jesus. Are we going to spend the rest of our lives filling in the gap in the story with preparing for that moment? So how do we do that? How do we get ready for him? Well, again, it's kind of a simple answer. Doesn't necessarily mean it's a quick or an easy answer, but it's a simple answer. And that answer is that we have to know him. We have to know who he is. How can we look like somebody if we don't know what they look like? We can't. If we don't know what Jesus looks like, we can't look like him. When we spend time getting to know him, that's when we start to look like him. We start to sound like him. We start to do the things that he does because we know what those things are. We might know the end of the story, but there's so much to fill in between here and there. And actually, that might sound overwhelming, that might sound scary, but it's exciting because we get to do that with him. And he wants to do that with us. He wants to partner with us to see that transformation. He's so excited about that. He's so excited to partner with us to fill in the rest of the story of our lives with transformation, with getting ready with us. He doesn't just leave us to get ready on our own. He is there with us, preparing with us, helping to prepare us for that day when we're face to face with him. On the days when the procrastinator in me is wanting to push aside this idea of getting ready and push aside the parts of me that I know Jesus is wanting to pick up and put back together, the thing that motivates me to pick them up and to push in, press in to transformation is the idea of that moment when I get to be face to face with him and hear the words from him, "Well done, good and faithful servant." When I think of that moment is enough, is more than enough to spur me on, to push through procrastination, to push through the fear, to push through whatever it is that might hold me back from getting ready, and to pursue him and to pursue transformation and to pursue getting ready for eternity with him. Because he is worthy. And we know the end of the story. We can't change the end of the story. And why would we try when the end of the story is so good? So good. Face to face with Jesus. Finally face to face with Jesus. Knowing that we have lived a life where we've gone after transformation the best that we've known how. Partnered with him to go from glory to glory as we've been transformed into his likeness. And so how do we respond to this? How do we respond to the idea of getting ready for him? Well, asking him to restore first love, if we feel like we've lost that, is a great first step. Asking him to captivate us again, tenderize our hearts. Asking him to show us what is our job in this partnership and what is his job. Where have we tried to do his job and where have we stopped doing our job? Asking him to bring into focus and reality the fact that we will be face to face with him one day. Sometimes it's easy for that reality to kind of fall to the wayside somewhat. And sometimes we have to ask him to bring those things back into our minds, into focus, so that we can hear him in our minds saying those words to us and imagine that moment and know that we still have some transforming to do before we're ready for that.